One and recording. Dr. Meryl Nass in between patients, and one of my new favorite guests, because last time, as I told you, when you brought up the robot armies, I fell in love. I was like, finally, someone that sees what I see. And it's for everyone listening, what we're referring to is when right now we're at a somewhat lucky place where soldiers and police can still turn down, inhumane orders. But when it's robots, it won't matter. It'll just be whatever the power elite want. But before I go any further, please introduce yourself to the new listeners.
Say that again.
I said, before I go any further, please introduce yourself to the new listeners.
Oh, okay. So my name is Meryl Nass. I am an internal medicine doctor, and I have a 30-year history of working and uncovering unusual epidemics, anthrax, vaccine injuries, particularly those from anthrax, smallpox vaccine, and now COVID. So I sort of delve into areas that other people know will not help their career and will not make them money. And those areas interest me because they would otherwise remain dark. And so I explore them and often, come up with interesting approaches.
So, whereas the last episode we kind of went in every direction simultaneously. What exactly did you do with anthrax and smallpox that other doctors like shunned away from? Was it just because it's not the most lucrative field? Is it investigative, or is it just, to you, was it a niche, like an intellectual curiosity?
Um, I was always a sort of left-wing activist, a Democrat, and I felt very strong. I was going to go into physics initially and was aware that physics had brought the atom bomb and felt like physicists had some personal responsibility for that. And so I wanted to go into a field where it couldn't be used in a bad way. So I went into medicine thinking I'd found one. And wasn't until I'd been through medical school and was practicing for a few years that I found out there was such a thing as biological warfare and chemical warfare, and that in fact, doctors had been involved with creating weapons, weapons of illness. And anyway, I was at a meeting, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and wound up being asked to investigate a professor who was doing research for the Pentagon on anthrax and supposedly anthrax vaccines. And so I investigated what it was he was doing. I read his contracts and his CV and found he was doing work on genetic engineering of anthrax. So, and that he was working for a particular Pentagon program that was called a biodefense program. So it sort of opened my eyes to this large area. And since I had expertise in medicine and in biology and science, I had a strong science background. I'm able to read papers and understand what they say and understand what they don't say and kind of see where the research has gone and why it hasn't gone in certain directions and it's gone in others. So I decided to, since he was doing something under the guise of vaccine research, I felt that there must be something bigger with this anthrax business. Why was the US government and other governments so interested in anthrax when we were having at that time one case diagnosed in the United States per decade? So turned out that anthrax was sort of the original biological weapon because it makes its own spore, and the spore is very impermeable to environmental effects. So it can withstand extremes of temperature and pressure. You can explode it from a bomb and it won't kill the bacteria in the spore. They're basically in suspended animation. And so for that reason, anthrax has been employed as a weapon over the years, a little bit here and there. So anyway, I read everything I could about anthrax and discovered that there had been this epidemic in 1978 through 1981 in Rhodesia during a civil war. and only in areas where Black people lived. None in, actually, there was, I think, one farm that had a few cases in cattle, which was a white-owned farm, like half a dozen cases at the most. And there were many thousands of cases on Black-owned farms. There are many thousands of cases in cattle and 10,000 human cases during that epidemic, which is called an epizootic because the animals get infected first. They graze and eat the anthrax spores, and then people who deal with the animals, either by butchering them or using an animal product like a hairbrush made with animals' hair, or an interlining of a jacket that's made from the animal, or bone meal, all of that has contained anthrax spores and gotten people sick.
Because they're so okay, so because they're so resistant, because the spores are so
Because the
resistant.
spores are so resistant, you can do all kinds of things to them and they
Okay.
survive.
So it's not like it gets pasteurized or baked out or autoclaved out.
So you can. I mean, if you use enough of a temperature, if you expose anthrax spores to bleach for 10 minutes, you'll kill them. But if you
Sure.
expose them for 1 minute, you're going to have a lot of them living through it.
Yeah. And people who are developing hairbrushes probably aren't, going through
Right,
those rigorous safety
exactly.
standards. Why would you?
So, well, now it's known, of course, that how this problem arises. And so there are industrial hygiene standards so that products made from livestock in countries where anthrax is present, and the United States and Canada have anthrax. So cattle die in both countries, usually every year, a few, from anthrax that they've picked up grazing. Anyway, so yes, so now men's suit coats don't give you anthrax anymore. But if you perhaps make a drum from a skin of an African cow, in Africa, they probably have not gone through the industrial hygiene processes, and you can pick up anthrax once in a blue moon.
Now, and this is a stupid question. Does anthrax occur naturally? Is it what, or was it bioengineered? Because I guess if it's in these
No,
communities,
originally, of course, it was a real disease.
okay,
It had a name in every country. In some countries, they called it wool sorter's disease or rag picker's disease, or charbon. Charbon is coal because it left a black eschar, sort of a black scab if you got it on your skin. You could also get a gastrointestinal infection, or if you inhaled it, which is what would happen in these sweatshops. If you inhaled it, then you could get it in your lungs and get a deadly, most of the time it was deadly.
does anthrax, does it reproduce? Is it viral? Does it reproduce, or is there a set
It's
amount?
bacterial.
Yes.
It reproduces in the soil.
Okay.
So it lives in soil, and every so often when the temperature and the conditions are ripe, it will reproduce in soil if there's enough organic material, enough water, blah, blah, blah. And it seems to come out when it outcompetes other soil organisms. So that's a theory, but it's a good one. So when you've had a drought or when you've had a flood, and a lot of other soil bacteria probably died as a result, the anthrax seems to be at high concentrations in the soil, and the animals are more likely to develop the disease.
So if I had anthrax, could I pass it to you in the same way that I could pass COVID?
No, I would
Okay.
not breathe it in from you.
Okay.
Um, if I shared a hairbrush with you, I might get it.
Okay.
A loofah.
Okay. So yeah, it sounds like a I don't know. It sounds like one of those like countless murder mystery stories, like the story
Right.
of like the anthrax laden loofah. It's the author towards the end of his career where he's really phoning it in. um, for okay, so all right, so then if it's like a case per decade, and if it's not like a virally in the same sense where COVID's hyper contagious, because shout out,
Mhm.
Fauci and his gain of function research. What was the why was the government so interested in it? It seems kind of
Right.
Like nuclear weapons make sense. It'd be like if the government was really, really into, I don't know, like machine guns with 3 barrels, and it'd be like, yeah, I mean, I guess it's more dangerous than a double barrel gun, but like there are nuclear weapons. What's the interest with anthrax then?
Well, you see, all these weapons have a different niche.
Okay.
So anthrax is good because it stays where you put it. So if you took an island, let's say Cuba, but it could be any island, and you dropped anthrax on that island, it's not going to go anywhere else, right? It may live in the soil there, may come out every few years for many, many years, for decades, maybe 100 years or more, but it's not going to, the fish aren't going to get it,
And
it's not going
get
to get
into
to
the
the main,
ecosystem.
right? So it's there. And the United States was working with the UK during World War II to make anthrax weapons to be dropped on Germany if necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And we're making them in Terre Haute, Indiana, cattle cakes of anthrax. I believe they were cattle cakes. Anyway, the war didn't go that long, so they weren't used. But the US, UK, France, Germany, many countries have Russia, China have all continued to explore anthrax, to work on better vaccines, and to make, I don't know if they're still doing it, but in the old days, to make more dangerous strains of anthrax.
Have you ever read Operation Paperclip by Annie Jacobson?
No, but I know a bit about Operation
Yeah,
Paperclip.
yeah. No, yeah, the whole. But they go into, that's where I learned that there was more than just rocket scientists. They go into the whole like. We also brought over a bunch of like chemical engineers and biological weapons engineers. It's kind of like the
Mhm.
lesson. I never knew about it, and then I've had on Dr. Alabek, and he talks about that in Biohazard, how they were taking strains and running it through animals to get even more and more killer strains. So if I'm using this as a weapon and I'm going after like Castro or something in the Cold War, and all right, so it stays on the island as opposed to something like if I tried to do like a dirty bomb, like like some uranium or something that would get into the atmosphere or get into the water tables and the fish, and it would end up in the the ecosystem, and eventually it would get like Chernobyl, right? They detected it, hundreds of miles away versus, and then like a virus, right? You drop smallpox on Moscow, it's only a matter of time before that's going to make it back to the US. Now, and it still isn't clicking with me like why you would, but you could also just use sarin gas or VX gas
Yes, you
on
could, but you
Cuba.
see, in Rhodesia, they got away with it. So for until I wrote my paper in 1992, from 1978 to 1992, people thought it was a natural event. They
Oh,
didn't.
this wasn't.
Oh
Oh,
no,
I thought. Oh, I thought I'm an idiot. I thought you were saying that it was a natural thing that you were studying. Okay, so there's kind of some like plausible deniability.
right,
Oh, all right. Whereas if a cloud of mustard gas blows up over your island, no
right.
one's like, "Oh, that's a natural event." It's okay. And not like COVID, where a smarter man than I could, you could look at the structure of it and say, is this natural or is this from a lab? And then maybe even what lab did it come from? Anthrax is more almost fingerprintless.
No, I mean, you can make things fingerprintless if you want, right? Because
Yeah.
the COVID was sort of fingerprintless. There was no known construct in a lab that was very close to it, but that doesn't, the thing is, all these labs that, are funded by the military in their respective countries are going to keep strains hidden. They're supposed to share every new strain with these international, you know, data banks,
Yeah.
but they don't. Right, of course. So people claim that this didn't come from a lab because there was no close relationship. But that's if everybody's honest. That's how the anthrax letters were investigated too, was
Mhm.
assuming everyone's going to be honest. So we've asked all these labs to provide us with all their anthrax strains. I mean, it was ridiculous. It
Yeah.
was totally ridiculous. The FBI did not go or whoever was investigating to seize all the strains. They asked for volunteers.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and
It was
it's
a pseudo investigation.
yeah, and not even like nuclear like arms proliferation where you can, right, I mean you could detect, right, there's only, you can only hide radiation so well, right? I mean we've had sniff, that's how we found out the Soviets detonated their bomb in 49, right, is because we had a sniffer plane flying off the coast of Alaska and we detected that so that technology's been there for a while. Whereas Ken Albeck, again in his book Biohazard, he talks about when they had international uh I guess inspectors come in, they would just move stuff to like different rooms in the lab, or they'd put it in the basement, or they'd hide it in like, like a closet or the air vent, like these like strains of like tularemia or something.
Yeah, but there weren't many inspections. So there weren't inspections between the United States and Russia until I think 1991.
Well, Albeck defected in 92, yeah, and told them that they had a bio. The Soviets were like, we don't, they mean to prove your point. The Soviets were like, we don't have a bioweapons program. And then Albeck defected and was like,
Yeah.
I was the deputy director. I was conscripted at like gunpoint. They have one. Right. Yeah. And that's something he talked about, how they were going to remove the warheads from ICBMs and put in things like anthrax and stable strains of smallpox, something that could be aerosolized and burst over cities.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's where the, I guess, the value, if you will, of anthrax comes in. Okay, I get it more now.
Well, there are other things. I mean, anthrax is easy to, it's produced naturally. It makes its own spore. So you don't need a high-tech lab to make it. You can just make it in a fermenter. The technology has been around since the 1930s to produce it. So it was called the poor man's atom bomb.
Yeah,
And it was part of US policy then around 1969 when Nixon initiated the ban
the
on
destruction.
biological
Yeah,
warfare research and production, that actually it was the United States didn't benefit from the existence of this class of weapon because it gave poorer countries an equal leg up to produce it, right? So what's his name? Feith. I think he may still be around, or his son is still around. Feith. Forget his first name. Yeah, came out with some statement like, why would we want to do this?
why would we want to get
And
rid of it, or why would we want to
the
keep it?
United States wants to be in realms where it is advantaged relative to other countries, right? So we have more soldiers than almost any country,
Yeah,
besides maybe China.
yeah.
Yeah. We have more aircraft carriers, we have more submarines,
Hmm.
say. But since a biological weapon is cheap to make, especially one like anthrax, we're not advantaged. Anybody can compete in that realm.
Was Feith, and I know I've been interrupting you nonstop. I've just got questions. Did you say Feith was saying, why are we doing this? Like, why are we getting rid of the weapons, or why are we doing this? Why are
No,
we?
we don't need them, saying that then it's not a particularly good class of weapons for us at that time.
Okay.
Now, unfortunately, what happened is genetic engineering was discovered just a very short few years later, around 1973. So Nixon made statements in 69 and 70 that we're going to get rid of all our biological weapons and all our toxin weapons, and we're going to create a treaty and get everyone to sign it and get everybody else to get rid of theirs. So that happened. The treaty was signed in 1975, just as genetic engineering was being developed. Well, then it became a fact that the United States could have a competitive advantage with biological weapons since we had, now more biologists than other countries, maybe expensive equipment to, just like with CRISPR now, that gives you certain advantages. Not that I know much about CRISPR. So whenever the US thinks they have an advantage, they want that kind of weapon to be accessible.
I feel like, because I mean, yeah, I mean, we have the largest military. China has more people. I think they have 2 million actual bodies, but we have more advanced technology, right? We have more aircraft carriers than every other nation combined. The world's largest air force is the U.S. Air Force. The world's second largest air force is the Navy, and then I think the third is China, and then the fourth is the U.S. Army. So yeah, I mean, but I would, in my limited knowledge, I would imagine that, yeah, because we want to dominate in every aspect, I would say that it's kind of the opposite of that. I would say ramp up the biological weapons. Like if we want to truly dominate in every arena, and I'm not necessarily condoning it, but I'm along those lines, right? I mean, we weren't for the Nazis, but we brought them back because we wanted the rockets. Because if the Soviets got them, we were done, right? We Unit 731, we brought back all over those. We brought back the head guys from there who, what you were saying, kind of the poor man's atom bomb was Shiro Ishii said. I've said it so many times in this podcast, but it's America is a machine society. We can't outbuild their ships, their Liberty ships, their aircraft, or their tanks, but it takes them 18 years to regrow a soldier. We can take out their soul. We brought all of them back. So I would imagine that we would want to advance in that field, even if it's the poor man's bomb, we would want to have the best poor man's bomb.
Well, the thing was, if we gave it up, I don't think we would have kept giving it up if we couldn't get the rest of the world to give it up.
Well, that's what I
So,
mean.
so as long as the rest of the world gave it up, we were doing well, right? We got rid of a field in which we didn't have an advantage, a competitive advantage, but nowadays we do. And so we have pushed the limits of that treaty. The United States has prevented inspections and sanctions to be put into that treaty. So it's a treaty without teeth. It was a treaty that was developed quickly, and they said we're going to have these meetings every 6 years and add teeth to the treaty as we have these meetings. And yet what's happened is that the US and sometimes other countries, but primarily the US, has put the kibosh on making the treaty meaningful. And at least during the Clinton administration, what we know about is that the United States went at least to the limits and probably beyond of the treaty by creating, building and, creating quantities of anthrax in these 3 programs that were described in the book Germs, which came out in 2001. So we know that in the 90s, the United States was going beyond what most scientists thought the treaty allowed. The treaty said, the interpretation of the treaty was that intent was the criterion. Well, the American interpretation of the treaty was that intent is the criterion. So basically, we can do anything as long as our intention is peaceful.
Yeah.
But the wording of the treaty says you can only create quantities of these bioweapons for peaceful purposes. In other words, for developing drugs or vaccines, against them.
Yeah. And intent, who's defining intent, or who's defining what good intent is?
Exactly.
Now, it works if we get the rest of the world to stop looking into it as well, but that's never worked. And I think Leo Szilard defecting from Germany and having Einstein write a letter, or Leo Szilard was also like the chauffeur for Ed Teller, which is oddly ironic, but they were writing the letter to FDR, and I think they wrote the first one, and they kind of didn't get a response. So I think, if I'm getting it correct, I think they had Einstein write it because his name had some weight behind it, and it was basically like, I think the wording was like, there will be the capacity for like a tremendous explosion with like a small, explaining what the atomic bomb was. And then FDR took it and was like, all right, let's do it. $2 billion in $1940. Let's get it done, because we can't bank on the Germans not doing it. And then when you look at the hydrogen bomb in Raven Rock by Garrett Graff, he talks about how Truman was born in a time where explosives were measured in tons. He was an artilleryman in World War One. He oversaw or approved the dropping of the A bomb, where it was measured in kilotons. And then Enrico Fermi, I think, came to him along with some other scientists, and they described what they said was the evil thing, and that was the hydrogen bomb, which was now going to be measured in megatons. And he didn't want to build it because they said that this isn't a tactical weapon. This is a weapon which there's no other way to use it. I think they said it has a built-in extermination policy. That's how big it is, right? We can't even test it on the land. We have to test it in the middle of the ocean. I'm saying all that to say Truman's only question, it was like a 7-minute meeting. None of them wanted to build it. They were all saying we should not build this. He said, can the Soviets do it? And they said, yes, it's only a matter of time. Then we have to do it. So we can't bank on anyone else not doing it. We have to have it, and we have to have the worst, most terrible form of it in order to keep everyone else at bay. It's still, in my mind, it would still go as like, we can't bank on anyone else not doing this. We have to make the most vicious Frankenstein, smallpox, bubonic plague, Marburg, anthrax thing out there in order to deter other people from doing it. It doesn't add up in my mind. Our entire thing is always about more, better, worse, more evil than anyone else. And then in this one area, we decide that we're not going to do it. It just, and I'm not questioning you. It's just my mind. It's not that it doesn't seem to fit, at least in what I understand of the U.S. government's, I guess, outlook on weapons programs.
Well, I mean, we have supposedly destroyed most of our nuclear weapons. You know, how many times over do you need to be able to destroy the world?
Sure.
We have stronger weapons now and probably
Yeah.
more targetable, but
Yeah.
fewer of them.
Yeah.
So, and subsequently in the I'm trying to think when the chemical weapons treaty came in, that was sometime in the 1990s, around 95, I think. So there was no chemical. So the Geneva Convention of 1925 basically said there shouldn't be any chemical weapons, but the United States had never ratified it. So we'd had chemical weapons all that time. And until about 1995, when the Chemical Weapons Treaty was written and signed by many countries. And I'm sure it had, you can't have a treaty of this nature without inspections.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people who create these treaties figure out, how can we detect, are there aluminum tubes? What is the thing that is detectable? And only if we can verify, the absence of these weapons, will we sign such a treaty.
Okay. So, all right, I think I'm following. So if I can kind of go back to it, what all did your paper shed light on? What did it flesh out in Rhodesia?
So I had looked at all the recent anthrax epidemics, the papers that had been written about them. And this one turned out to be the largest by far, but it also had totally different properties. It jumped around from one place to another. And it obeyed national borders. So it didn't go beyond Rhodesia. It would get close to the border and stop. It also didn't follow the usual weather patterns. It didn't happen after a flood or a drought or some other extreme weather necessarily. Some of the characteristics were like normal anthrax. So people did get it from animals. It was really a problem primarily for cattle, and cattle were the fount of wealth of families, Black families in particular, in Rhodesia. So the fact that this was going on during a sort of 15-year period of low intensity warfare, and then later guerrilla warfare in Rhodesia, with the blacks against the whites, and the fact that it happened only in, and Rhodesia had, as South Africa had designated certain areas of the country for black habitation, right? So they were called tribal trust lands. So they gave the least valuable agricultural areas to the blacks, and those were the areas that got attacked. And it was the cattle, their source of wealth, that was attacked. So it was basically a food reduction policy, I think. Anyway, what I was able to show was that in 5 separate, you can only do this if nobody knows about anthrax, right? Once people start realizing what an anthrax epidemic or epizootic is supposed to look like, it becomes perfectly clear this wasn't one. But because nobody knew, and because a few papers were published describing it, but not in such a way that you might suspect there was a problem. And the only people who really knew about anthrax were all people who worked for governments on their biological warfare or biodefense programs, and they're not going to say anything. In fact, it's my contention that the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, the French, all had people in Rhodesia. Rhodesia was, at that time, was a proxy war, kind of like Spain right before World War II. The major powers were helping and watching to see what was going on. And I think the use of anthrax sort of gave everybody information about, well, what would it be like if we used anthrax?
Sure.
What can we expect to happen? And so there was I'm saying that because I FOIA'd several federal agencies for their documents on it, and found that, in fact, the State Department was sending back very frequent communiques on what was going on with the anthrax. So anyway, what was I saying? What my paper did was explore, describe the ways it didn't seem to be natural, describe the different justifications that had been used for why it happened the way it did. For example, people said insects were spreading anthrax. And in fact, that theory, which is a bogus theory, made it into medical textbooks. So for a period of time, shortly before I wrote my paper and for a few years afterwards, medical textbooks said that anthrax could be spread by flies. And there were specific flies people thought were most likely to spread it. And so I went and examined each one of those flies and explained why it couldn't do it. So another theory was that people were shipping meat around the country, and that the meat, which could be filled with anthrax spores, was spreading it. And I explained why that theory wasn't sufficient to explain the large number of cases and the widespread of the disease. Anyway, there were things like that. So I took all the explanations apart, showed that they were all false, and nobody was left with anything but biological warfare. So no one's ever disputed people have said you're full of shit, but they've never actually said these are the arguments why you're full of shit. They can't argue with what I wrote because it was biological warfare. Anthrax doesn't happen that way. And I was hoping when I did it that it would be a deterrent for, people would hesitate to use anthrax and hopefully other biological weapons again, once they found that you could actually go back in history, and start studying an epidemic and figure out whether it was due to biological warfare. And then you look for a perpetrator. So my work did not look for the perpetrator. I feel like that's a political thing.
Well, no, and I think that probably gives more legitimacy to it. When you go to something and you go, this isn't who did what or why did they did it. It's like, let's just look at what happened. I think that gives it more legitimacy. Yeah, when people say you're full of shit, that's good, because that means they can't meet you on the arena of intellectual debate with facts and figures. When they start attacking you, that's good. That means you won. when they can't, if I, if I failed pre-calculus 3 times in college and I would get so angry at the class. I would just be like, math sucks. I don't even need it. And it's like, you know, I bragged about doing well in OChem or cellular biology. When I started attacking the course, I'm like, math is stupid. I'm like, that's because you're failing it, you idiot. Other people said organic chemistry is stupid. Why do I need this for medicine? And I said, you're just angry because you're not doing well at it. Work harder. And then when the tables are turned and I do bad at math, I'm like, well, this is it. I don't, it's sure, but that's so having been on the receiving and the delivering end, yeah, when you start to resort to personal attacks, it means you've lost. What you were saying about them attacking the food sources in the predominantly black owned lands, yeah, that kind of sounds like in a more advanced, in an evil way, but in a more advanced way of like Stalin with engineered famine. And it also, I had on Gordon Chang 2 weeks ago, and I've heard this brought up before, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on this about how you could genetically, because like, right, Dr. Kurt Bloma in the Nazi, I guess, biological weapons campaign, his whole thing was because they had memories from World War I about, what happens when you launch chlorine gas or mustard gas, same thing,
Mhm.
and the winds turn, right? It then
Right.
now be right. So they wanted to come up with biological weapons programs, but they also didn't want to kill their own military. So they called it the sword and the shield, right? The sword being the attack and the shields being we'll vaccinate ourselves beforehand. You can kind of go one step further and advance it even more. And this is what Gordon Chang said, is that you could find specific, I guess, sequences or genes in a race of people that you don't like that, for instance, I think it's like Koreans, right? They're lacking like the same amount of like alcohol dehydrogenase enzymes. My friend Sung Yup in college could only drink like 2 beers before he'd throw up. He'd get red in the face.
Mhm.
Now that doesn't have anything to do with warfare, but what I could go do is, let's say I'm a white Irish nationalist and I go, all right, well, my people can drink alcohol. All I need to do is create a weapon that targets people with this lacking enzyme or whatever. And it doesn't even have to go after that enzyme. It just be that's the marker. Now, kill them with whatever, smallpox. Do you see that as something that's probably going on behind the scenes, which we'll never see declassified?
Yeah.
Weapons going after, I mean, truly like Hitler's wet dream, like a weapon that only kills black people or Jewish people or white Irish people and anything in between?
Yeah, so there's actually been a lot talked about. And we know that in South Africa, which had a pretty significant chem bio weapons program, that in fact they were trying to find or develop weapons that would target blacks. We also know that you don't have to look that hard. They also used prostitutes with HIV to target black people to try and kill them. And we can only assume that multiple other governments have done the same thing because their program was exposed in 1993.
Jesus. So that's absolutely on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're a radical Islamic terrorist, right? You hit the World Trade Center in New York, right? It's the icon of it's the global, right? It's the kind of the global hub, Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center. You have all these people hit the Pentagon, the face of American military force, but you're not blowing up Mecca. Whereas if you could get a virus that just attacked only the people you want, you don't need to worry about necessarily taking out the Jewish homeland. You don't need to worry about taking out Beijing, or you don't need to worry about you could just engineer it against the people you don't like. And then just kind of like what Edward Teller said about the backyard bomb. He wanted to develop a 10 gigaton bomb,
Mm-hmm.
which was a 10,000 megatons. And his idea in the Air Force, I think he put it forward kind of as a joke, but the Air Force actually kind of heard him out on it, which is insane. But it was the backyard bomb. You don't need to drop it on Russia. You just put it in your backyard and detonate it, and you'll kill everyone on the planet. There's something about that with like with like a race specific virus. I don't need to go drop it in Moscow. I can just walk outside, see the maintenance guy, put it on him, and that will go to someone else. And if it's dormant and inactive, I mean, especially if you made it dormant and still like passable, then the people I don't want dead could get it and still pass it, and it would never affect them until it gets to the targets, which is just, I mean, man, that would be more devastating than a nuclear weapon. That would truly be like an instantaneous strike if no one knew they had it, and then all of a sudden, all your enemies just start dropping like flies. Jesus, I'm not really asking a question. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Sorry. But yeah, that's I don't know. Real quick, I know I've got you for 7 more minutes. Back to the anthrax. Wasn't, and I'm not as well versed on this as I should be, but wasn't a huge part of like the '01, '02 anthrax scare, if those are the correct, if that's the correct time frame, wasn't
Mhm.
a huge part about it that like the quality of it was that it couldn't have been like a poor man's weapon. It would have had to have been a nation state. Is it, wasn't it, the little bit I know is
Okay, I
what,
can answer the question.
okay.
Yeah, okay, so it was Ames anthrax, and Ames was the last strain that the United States weaponized. So, yeah, it's a fairly potent strain. It was not, it didn't have enough of a fingerprint, though, supposedly. And many countries, I know the US government said there were only 3 countries that had it, but that wasn't true. I actually went, just looked Ames up on PubMed and found at least 6 countries that had published papers working with Ames. Because I knew from going to anthrax conferences that Ames was the strain you use to test your vaccines against in animal experiments, right? You're trying to give them the strongest anthrax if you vaccinated your animals. Anyway, so yes, Ames was a strong, naturally occurring, found in soil, and it's been found many times in the United States in soil, but it's been shared, as I said, with other nations. But then you can also make, chimeric anthrax. I mean, the possibilities are somewhat unlimited. I mean, for example, let's go to COVID. So COVID causes a viral illness for about a week, but after that, it causes an autoimmune illness.
Mm-hmm.
If you're one of the people who has the late stage, and it causes a blood clotting illness, right? So it has these sequelae, these consequences that are very unusual, that don't happen with other naturally occurring respiratory infections that we are accustomed to. It may have happened with SARS-1. I can't guarantee you that SARS-1 was natural, but it certainly hasn't occurred from any other virus people have seen before. This sort of massive cytokine storm with these terrible sequelae that have the potential to kill young people. And yes, it doesn't kill that. I mean, most people can skate through this illness, but the ones who get a bad case of it for whatever genetic or nutritional or other reasons are very hard to treat. So we have ivermectin, we have hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine works during the first week. It doesn't work afterwards. That may work a little bit afterwards, but not much. Monoclonal antibodies probably work the first week, but you don't need them if you have hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Ivermectin works very well the first week. After that, ivermectin works to some extent, but you really need to start treating all these downstream effects. Your virus is gone. After week 1 or 10 days, there's no more live virus. It's finished. The rest of it is your body destroying itself.
Jesus. Wasn't, with the anthrax, wasn't it, I'm gonna butcher the terminology, but wasn't it like there was some sweet spot where like you wanted the spores like smaller and smaller, but if they
So
got too small, there would be an electrostatic attraction, and then they wouldn't spread because
let
they
me
would.
I'll tell you the
Yeah.
facts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anthrax, if you grow it as a spore, it's about 1 nanometer by 1.5 or 2 nanometers, maybe a little bit bigger. And, or I should say micron, not nanometer, excuse me. I'm off. When you grow it, it all clumps together and you have to break it apart. And so in order to inhale something into the depths of your lungs to get an infection, the story has been for many decades, it needs to be smaller than 5 microns. All right. So the primitive biological weapon, they would actually grind the anthrax after they grew it to try to get it to a small enough size. And supposedly the Iraqis had this bentonite to help separate the spores. But the anthrax in the second set of, so the first set of letters was kind of old anthrax. It wasn't very purified. It didn't have a charge, and the spores didn't float away from each other. Now that may be because of what happened in transit in the mail, okay? But the first set didn't look fancy. The second set, allegedly, the spores separated from each other so that you could, and there was no junk. So you could fit 1 trillion spores per gram into the letter, and each letter supposedly had about 2 grams worth of spores. And then as soon as they could be released, plus they could go through the pores of the paper in the envelope. But once they were released, that you could see a puff of smoke. Now, there are ways of giving things a charge. So that probably was done in in an advanced laboratory, but there are probably multiple countries that know how to do it. A funny thing in the way the FBI investigated was, they asked a few countries to give them their anthrax spores, but they never really looked for a perpetrator outside the United States. Now, if I were going to create the anthrax letters, if I wanted to use an anthrax bioweapon in the US, I would get it from one of my buddies in another country, right? Because, our FBI, our police can't just go in there and start investigating. You have to get permissions. So that would be the best way to hide it. And the FBI never considered that as a possibility.
So as opposed to the FBI being able to go look at US laboratories,
which they didn't do very much of either, except to harass, people at Fort Detrick.
Yeah. But the logic being that that's where they would go versus they can't go to Wuhan or they can't go to wherever in Moscow or something.
Well, that's true. They can't go to Wuhan or Moscow, but what they can do is read the literature and see whether Wuhan or Moscow has developed the technology to produce spores like this.
Yeah.
So somebody went to the literature and sent me a copy of a paper showing me that in Israel, for instance, they had developed a method that could produce spores like this. Published, I don't know, around 2008, I think, maybe 2010. So, and that was at a military facility. So I assume, multiple countries can do this.
Well, on that terrifying note, I said I wouldn't keep you past 250. It's 251, so I lied. I can't wait till the next one, Dr. Nass. I'm more scared now than I was 50 minutes ago, and seems to be the course of action for this podcast to scare the shit out of me, and then for some reason, like Stockholm syndrome, I go back to it. So I will let you go. I know you have another patient. I can't wait till the next episode. And thank you so much for your time today.
Good to see you again, Tommy.
You as well. Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. God bless America. And